The story of medieval Đại Việt is the story of northern Vietnam, centred primarily on the Red River Valley and the capital city of Hà Nội. It was traditionally a country of people with its own unique identity, but strongly influenced by the mighty Chinese cultures directly on its northern borders. Its history is a fascinating blend of cultures and a demonstration of how geography is a major factor in warfare, as the different Vietnamese dynasties would face challenges from the militarily superior Chinese armies to the north, as well as the modern southern Vietnamese Cham people of the Confederation of Champa. Let's track the history of northern Vietnam from its roots right through to the end of its medieval period. The History of the World podcast, written and presented by Chris Hasler.
I wrote a little song to remind you, Choice Hotels gets you more of the experiences you value. The Cambria Hotel's got it all. A rooftop bar, have a ball. Cocktails up here feel just right. Is Cambria amazing? Alright. Bring a date, your team, or even your mom. Book direct at choicehotels.com. See you on the roof.
When you need to build up your team to handle the growing chaos at work, use Indeed Sponsored Jobs. It gives your job post the boost it needs to be seen and helps reach people with the right skills, certifications, and more. Spend less time searching and more time actually interviewing candidates who check all your boxes. Listeners of this show will get a $75 sponsored job credit at Indeed.com/podcast. That's Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply. Need a hiring hero? This is a job for Indeed Sponsored Jobs.
Volume 4, The Medieval World. Episode 79, The Kingdom of Đại Việt. History, the nucleus of origin of Vietnamese identity and culture, originated from the Red River Valley in the north of the modern country of Vietnam. Evidently, there were Paleolithic peoples living on this river and occupation of the area by different cultures ever since. The Bronze Age reached Vietnam around 4,000 years ago, a similar period to when rice cultivation arrived there from the north and the lands that we recognise today as South China. Much of these earliest Vietnamese cultures can also be distinguished by their pottery styles. Bronze Age Vietnamese cultures also became expert hunters and especially fishermen with a range of hunting weapons and boat building. Today's episode is about Đại Việt, which was the name of the Vietnamese monarchy from medieval times right up until modern times, when the country would eventually assume its modern name, Vietnam. Chronicles from the Đại Việt period refer back to a legendary period in time when absolute monarchs called the Hung kings ruled over Vietnamese lands and peoples during a period called the Hong Bang. One of the earliest Hung kings was the Dragon King of Lat, descended from dragons, and he was married to a goddess called O Gu. O Gu produced an egg sac, and 100 children hatched from the sac. These children are the ancestors of the Vietnamese people, and this represents a creation myth of the Vietnamese people. The Hung kings of the Hong Bang dynasty ruled over a state called Phan Lang, with its capital, for the most part, at Phong Châu, which is a little further upriver of the Red River from the modern Vietnamese capital city of Hà Nội. Van Lang was conquered in the year 258 BCE from the north by the ruler of the Viet tribes, and he united all the tribes together as a state called Lac, and this ruler would take the regnal name An Dong Vung. An Dong Vung ruled over Lac until he was around 121 years old, according to traditional histories. During the period of An Dong Vung's state of Lac, the Qin dynasty of China emerged to the north of Vietnamese lands. In the modern world, Vietnam shares a border with China, but there was a little bit of a void between the lands under the Qin dynasty of China and the state of Lac. This void would be exploited by a man called Zhao Tuo after the fall of the relatively short-lived Qin dynasty of China. Zhao Tuo had been a general who had served Qin China, and he himself had been instrumental in the subjugation of the lands of the south. Zhao Tuo seized these lands for himself, and they would be known as Nan Yue. By 179 BCE, Zhao Tuo annexed Lac and created a state that would stretch from the lands of southern China all the way down to the southern reaches of the Gulf of Tonkin. It was after the mighty Han dynasty took control of China that things would become gradually more and more tense for the state of Nan Yue. The Han dynasty dominated and modernised China from the 2nd century BCE and looked to control the behaviour of the societies on their borders. The Han faced a lot of problems from their north from the nomadic Xiongnu, so they would appreciate some loyalty from their south from Nan Yue. The fact that Zhao Tuo did not have a large army, alongside the fact that the Han had threatened to execute his family, ensured that the Han would have little trouble from their south. Nan Yue was eventually annexed by Han China, following a period of tension where a Chinese lady married the Nan Yue king and campaigned to pledge Nan Yue to Han China, which led to her execution by the Nan Yue Prime Minister. The Han Chinese were suitably upset by the murder of the Queen and invaded and annexed Nan Yue as a consequence. The Vietnamese lands remained somewhat peaceful under Han rule. They retained a degree of autonomy, so they were able to maintain their cultural identity. Chinese commanderies operated in Vietnam to secure the loyalty of the region. At the end of the 4th decade of the first millennium, Han China began to apply more pressure on the Vietnamese by increasing taxes, and this brought about an era of rebellion. A Vietnamese general called T Sac was part of an aristocratic uprising of the Vietnamese, and as such he was captured and executed by the Chinese. It would be his widow, Chun Chak, and her sister, Chun Ni, who would take control of the rebellion in the aftermath. This was an age where females were entitled to inherit titles and wealth from their parents and had a degree of power level with their male counterparts, something not seen in all areas of the world during this period. The Chung sisters used military means, with many battalions also led by females, to run the Chinese governor out of Vietnam. Their success led to a period of Vietnamese independence that is a proud and celebrated memory of Vietnamese history. The period was short-lived as Han China prepared to make a full-scale annexation of Vietnam, and despite previous successes, the aristocratic class realised that resistance was futile, and so the Chung sisters just simply did not have the power to prevent Han annexation. History does not make it completely clear whether the Chung sisters were captured and executed, or whether they chose to commit suicide before this inevitable fate. For the remainder of the Han dynasty's existence, a strong effort to Sinicize the Vietnamese people to prevent further rebellion took place. The Sinicization of the Vietnamese people would never be completed. Even with many Chinese immigrants marrying into the local Vietnamese families, Vietnamese language and culture prospered. To the south, Vietnamese people drifted away from those in the north. The southerners were more closely connected to Indian cultures that had migrated eastwards from the subcontinent. A kingdom called Lam Ap would emerge in central Vietnam as a consequence, effectively independent from the Red River Valley lands under the control of the Han. With the fall of the Han dynasty at the end of the 2nd century, China fragmented, and there would be a definite north-south cultural distinction in the aftermath. Of course, Vietnam was more closely linked to the southern Chinese cultures, and although Vietnam was still under Chinese rule, the Vietnamese could make greater demands of their weakened Chinese overlords, further encouraging the existence of a distinctly Vietnamese culture and identity. During this period, which historians refer to as the Chinese Dark Ages, northern Vietnam remained under Chinese control, while Lam Ap would extend its influence along the coast from its borders with the north, all the way down to the lands around the modern city of Ho Chi Minh City in southern Vietnam. This was the earliest formation of the Champa state, and we will be dedicating an episode to the southern Vietnamese cultures of Champa. In the 6th century, southern China was under the control of the Liang dynasty. A Vietnamese man called Li Bi served as a magistrate to the Liang dynasty, but he became dissatisfied with the way that the Liang dynasty officials were mistreating the local population. Li Bi instigated a rebellion against the Chinese officials, and by the year 544 he had successfully expelled the officials and declared a new independent Vietnamese state called Van Xuan. It had been almost 300 years since China was unified under one dynasty, when the Sui dynasty successfully unified China towards the end of the 6th century. The Sui demanded the submission of Van Xuan, which was refused. This led to a Sui invasion that resulted in the eventual submission of Van Xuan and its reintegration into the Chinese sphere of influence. The Sui dynasty of China was comparatively short-lived before it made way for the Tang dynasty, who seized power. The Tang would impose heavy taxation on non-Chinese subjects, and inevitably this would stir up tensions with people such as the Vietnamese. It would also stir up tensions with other neighbours of the Tang, which would cause fundamental disruption of the peace of the realm, and this only helped the Vietnamese to consider their independence again. Tang preoccupations with the Turkic Khaganates to the north meant that the southern territories were less effectively governed. The peoples of the modern Yunnan province of southwest China established their own kingdom called Nanzhao, which was geographically close to the polities of Southeast Asia. Nanzhao invaded the Vietnamese lands of the Red River Valley, but the Vietnamese were ultimately able to resist these invasions, which is something that is likely to have stirred a strong feeling of national pride. At the beginning of the 10th century, both the Tang dynasty of China and the kingdom of Nanzhao collapsed, creating a situation whereby the Vietnamese people could carve out their own independent area of power for themselves.
No Gwen.
For the early part of the 10th century, Vietnam was relatively peaceful, with the disappearance of the aggressive state of Nanzhao and the disunity of China. The Vietnamese were able to retain control of their heartlands around the Red River Valley. In China, a man called Liu Yan had established an area of control in 917 that came to be known as Nan Han, otherwise known as Southern Han, which was a legitimizing reference back to the mighty Han dynasty that had ruled China 1,000 years earlier. Liu Yan claimed descent from the Han dynasty. The Southern Han only occupied an area along the southern coast of China as one of the 10 kingdoms of the 5 dynasties and 10 kingdoms period, a transitional period of Chinese history. The Southern Han's ambition was to expand westwards into Vietnamese territory. The initial Southern Han invasion came in 931 and was repelled by the Vietnamese. The Southern Han had captured the military ruler of the Vietnamese state, and in his absence there was a scramble for power in Vietnam. The military general Kieu Gong Tien, who was pro-Southern Han, had seized power in Vietnam before a rebellious warlord called No Nguyen decided to challenge him. Kieu Gong Tien appealed to the Southern Han Emperor Liu Yan for support, so Liu Yan initially sent his son and then followed along himself with a secondary force. The resulting battle was a naval battle which took place on the Bac Dang River, further northwards up the coast from the Red River, but likewise a river which flowed into the Gulf of Tonkin. No Nguyen's approach to battling against the impressive warships of the Southern Han seems uniquely ingenious. The Vietnamese enticed the Southern Han warships into the Bac Dang River at high tide. The warships obliged and chased the smaller Vietnamese vessels into the river. As the tide recessed, the plan became apparent. Planted into the riverbed were iron-tipped poles which prevented the safe passage downriver of the Southern Han warships, many of which were spiked by the poles. It was at this point that the Vietnamese attacked the prone warships and slaughtered around half of the manpower on board, including Liu Yan's son. This was enough of a defeat to send the Southern Han into retreat. No Nguyen was victorious, and he would eventually declare himself as the king of Vietnamese lands. Previous to this, the lands of Vietnam had been seen as subservient to China, but now it was independent in its own right. No Nguyen moved the capital city away from Đại La, the administrative centre that had been managed from China, and found a new location on the opposite side of the Red River at Co Lua. When No Nguyen died in the year 944, there was a succession crisis as his sons were too young to rule effectively. The period is called the period of the 12 warlords, reflecting the scramble for power of many. One of the 12 warlords was a peasant called Ding Bo Ling. Ding Bo Ling took advantage of the distrust of the Vietnamese aristocracy to increase his stock, and he would campaign against other warlords, gathering support for his cause from the general population. After successfully unifying all of the local factions via both conquest and diplomacy, he would proclaim himself as the emperor of a Vietnamese state which he named Đại Việt in the year 968. The capital was moved once again to Hoa Lu, a considerable distance south from the two previously mentioned capitals, which were both in close proximity to the modern capital of Hanoi. The new capital was on the banks of the Đại River. During the reign of Ding Bo Ling, the Song dynasty took control of China, which would have potential consequences for Vietnam had Ding Bo Ling not acted quickly and sent tribute to the new Chinese state, ensuring the Vietnamese independent status was respected by China. Dinh Bo Linh centralised the government and standardised many aspects of the state, such as areas of law and military. Dinh Bo Linh was a strong advocate of Buddhism, so we also see this Dinh dynasty period as a period of construction of temples and pagodas. The Dinh dynasty was short-lived though. Dinh Bo Linh was assassinated by a court official, and this actually excited the Song dynasty of China into believing that they could force subservience from Vietnam again, as former Chinese dynasties had done before them. So a Song army was sent to Vietnam, only to find that the military organisation of Vietnam was better than expected. The Vietnamese military general called Le Huan led his men to a defensive victory over the Song, which ultimately allowed him to establish himself as the new emperor of Viet and instigate a new period known as the Early Le dynasty, called early purely to historically distinguish it from the later Le dynasty, which started from the 15th century. After successfully repelling Song China, Le Huan would resume tribute offers to maintain the peace. This would have been quite important, as Viet was also facing military challenges from the state of Champa to their south. Le Huan would successfully defend his territory, both militarily and diplomatically. On Le Huan's death, once again we see a bumpy succession. Le Huan's sons were unpopular, and it fell on the shoulders of a commander of the palace's royal guards, who would become known as Li Tai To, to take control of the state and start the beginning of a more sustained dynasty called the Li dynasty. The capital was moved back to Đài La in proximity to modern Hanoi, and Đài La would be renamed Thăng Long.
The Lý dynasty.
In contrast to the short-lived Dinh and early Le dynasties, the Lý dynasty ruled over Vietnam for over 2 centuries. Despite Vietnam having a desire to distance itself from China, there were still many aspects of Chinese culture heavily ingrained in the Vietnamese culture. Buddhism was heavily observed in Vietnam, but there were also aspects of Confucianism influencing the state, and that was something that had manifested itself during the Chinese years of overlordship. Li Tai Tong, the son of the previous emperor Li Tai To, built a pagoda over a lotus pond called the One Pillar Pagoda, and it remains today as one of the most iconic Buddhist temples in Vietnam. Despite an apparent affection for Buddhism, Lý dynasty Vietnam was tolerant of other spiritual observances, such as Taoism and ancient faiths. Li Tai Tong is regarded as a strong emperor. He reformed many aspects of the state, but particularly notable are his humanitarian efforts, which involved regarding the comfort of the slave class and suspected criminals, who were treated respectfully and fairly. Tax breaks could be awarded to those in poverty. Despite all of this, his management of the state was strong enough to encourage Champa to think twice about their attacks on Vietnam. Li Tai Tong also led a successful campaign into Champa territory. Li Tai Tong was succeeded by his own son, who ruled as Li Tan Tong from the year 1054. Upon his succession, he changed the name of the kingdom to Đại Việt from Đại Viet, which is believed to have been conducted in order to demonstrate Đại Viet's strength, as Đại Việt means Great Viet. It seems that Đại Việt had got the measure of the Chams of the kingdom of Champa to the south during the middle of the 11th century. On the northern borders there was a lot of unrest, which made the borders unsustainable. Both Đại Việt and Song China would have been wary of the other's intentions. Li Tang Tong was succeeded by his own son, who ruled as Li Nyang Tong. Shortly after Li Nyang Tong's succession, he would plan a campaign against Song China. The army of Đại Việt marched into Song territory and besieged the city of Nanning, which at the time was called Yongzhou. The Chinese city fell to Đại Việt after 42 days of siege, and I have to admit that this is the only time in history that I can find an example of a Vietnamese army successfully attacking a Chinese city. Inevitably, this would prompt a backlash from China. An army almost 4 times the size of that which Li Nyang Tong brought to Nanning was assembled by China, and a counter-invasion took place which almost reached the capital city of Vietnam, Thang Long. The Vietnamese army was able to hold off the Chinese for long enough to prevent Chinese interest in continuing, and both sides agreed a truce that resulted in the return of all conquered lands and prisoners of war. So really this was quite an impressive military campaign by Đại Việt against their much larger and more powerful neighbour. During the Song-Đại Việt War, it may not be surprising to know that the kingdom of Champa supported Song China. Champa had ended up on the wrong end of the result in its own conflicts with Đại Việt during the 11th century and had even seen their own kings captured or killed. Tensions remained between Đại Việt and Champa going into the 12th century, but the intensity weakened as Champa realised that it simply wasn't powerful enough to make any lasting incursions into Đại Việt territory. As much as the combined territories of Đại Việt and Champa make up an area very nearly the same as the modern country of Vietnam, there was a definite cultural distinction between the north and the south, with the Champa in the south being more Indianised and Đại Việt in the north being more Sinicized. During the 11th century, Đại Việt introduced imperial examinations for the highest political and administrative duties in the state, which was a practice introduced in China to prevent nepotism. The Temple of Literature opened in 1070 and was dedicated to the Chinese philosopher Confucius. There was also a real advancement in the arts in Đại Việt during the Lý dynasty. Literature including poetry, performing arts including music and theatre, works of sculpture, particularly of the Buddha, all appear to have emerged and improved during this period, which can reflect well a period of relative stability and prosperity.
The Chan dynasty.
The end of the Lý dynasty wasn't particularly dynamic. The final rulers were weak rulers, and this made the transition into the new dynasty fairly fluid. There was no great battle or major rebellion involved. It was early in the 13th century that the teenager Li Huidong became the new emperor. Li Huidong was not in good mental health, and members of the Chan family were very aware of this. The Chan family were descendants of Chinese immigrants and as such were more familiar with Chinese politics. They ensured that as many Chan family members were employed in roles within the royal court and government so that they could orchestrate what was going on. The poor mental health of the Emperor Li Huidong and the fact that he only had a female infant as a possible heir was exactly what the Chan family needed to take control. Li Huidong was persuaded to retire to a monastery and abdicate his throne to his 7-year-old daughter, who was promptly married to a member of the Chan family called Chan Tai Tong, and so the Lý dynasty's rule over Đại Việt was now effectively over, and the Chan family had got exactly what they wanted: control of Vietnam. Much as the Lý dynasty rulers had prompted the process of imperial examinations to select individuals for important government roles, this was not practiced well, and the Chan rulers, from their Chinese background, believed in and exercised this process a lot better. They would need to have some real stability because life for most of Asia was going to radically change during the 13th century with the emergence of the Mongols. Those regular listeners will already be very familiar with the emergence of the Mongols and how they gradually conquered China. Going into the fateful 13th century, China had been split into two halves. The southern half contained the traditional Song dynasty that had once been the mighty rulers of China in its entirety. The northern half had been conquered by peoples from the grasslands of the north called the Jurchens, and they had established the Jin dynasty to the north, which subsequently put them in the direct firing line of the Mongols, who had expanded on the northern borders of the Jin, becoming more and more powerful before invading and ultimately successfully conquering the whole of Jin China by the year 1234. Later in the same century, Song China would become a target for the Mongols, and the conquest of Song China would require an approach from a number of fronts, including from the direction of Đại Việt. The Mongols knew that there would be a major strategical advantage to the occupation of Đại Việt, so they planned a campaign as early as the 1250s under their ruler Mongke Khan. The son of Sube'etei, the highly regarded general of the Mongol army, was called Urianghadai, and he would be sent to Đại Việt by the Emperor Mongke. Initially, Urianghadai would send envoys to the Đại Việt court to negotiate a relationship, but Đại Việt had developed a strong understanding with Song China, where the Song recognised the ruler of Đại Việt as an independent king in a mutually beneficial relationship. Đại Việt had no motivation at this point in history in supporting a Mongol invasion of Song China, so they imprisoned the Mongol envoys, which is seen as a very bold and offensive move. Urianghadai therefore sent an invasion force into Đại Việt, with the target being the capital city of Thăng Long. The Mongols, with their army, which was inclusive of the cavalry which they were so famed for their expertise with, would encounter a Vietnamese army which would contain the traditional elephants that were fairly commonly used in Vietnamese armies over the centuries. The Mongols had to develop a strategy to combat these huge and unusual animals which struck fear not just into the Mongols, but more so into their horses. So they directed their arrow fire at the elephants' feet, which seemed like a good strategy. The Vietnamese army quickly boarded their boats on the Red River and fled downstream, abandoning their capital city in the process. With Thăng Long occupied, it looked very much as if the Mongols were well on their way to the conquest of Đại Việt. In the following days, fortunes changed dramatically. The climate and geography of Đại Việt was hugely different to what the Mongols were used to, and they didn't have the facility to feed themselves and their horses well. Disease ran rampant through the Mongol army and their horses, leading to a large number of deaths. The Vietnamese initially planned to seek exile in Song China, but now they could return as the Mongols made a hasty retreat from Đại Việt, abandoning their gains. The Battle of Ain Jalut in the Levant in 1260 is often remembered as the first major loss in battle for the Mongols, but the Vietnamese loss happened even earlier in 1258, so the Vietnamese have a very strong claim in saying that it was actually them who were the first to successfully defeat the Mongols in battle. Kublai Khan had supported his older brother Mongke with his imperial ambitions, and when Mongke died in 1259, it would eventually be Kublai who would become the Mongol emperor. Kublai would be the one to successfully conquer Song China, and once this had been successfully achieved, then Đại Việt became a target because it would make Kublai Khan's sea route to the west easier to negotiate. Kublai Khan decided to attack Champa initially, which was further down the coast on this journey, and they asked to cross Đại Việt, but were refused, which meant that the attack on Champa had to be a naval campaign instead, something that really tested the naval capabilities of the Mongols to unprecedented levels for them. This inconvenience would not be forgotten. Đại Việt knew that an attack was imminent and prepared themselves for the conflict. The Mongols were so strong that despite the commitment of the Vietnamese army, they found themselves pushed back and had to retreat southwards as the Mongols once again successfully took the capital city of Thăng Long in 1285. The Vietnamese were both brave and cunning. Captured soldiers were found to have the words Sat Tat tattooed on their bodies, which translates to mean death to Tartars, with Tartars being synonymous with Mongols in this case. Understandably, from the Mongol point of view, such tattooed soldiers were executed. In the process of losing Thăng Long, the Vietnamese retreated southwards with all of their grain supplies. This was a clever move, as had been proven before. Feeding a large army in Đại Việt territory was almost impossible for the Mongols, and the more tropical climate of these lands closer to the equator proved too unusual for the Mongols, who would often find disease spreading quickly through their overpopulated ranks. The Mongols had to change their strategy and split their army, which proved to be the opening that the Đại Việt army needed, as they would be able to target elements of the fragmented and weakened Mongol army and drive them out of Đại Việt once more. Yet another eventual victory for Đại Việt, this time after 6 months of battle. The Mongols planned yet another invasion, with much more in the way of naval power just a couple of years later. Despite looting the capital city of Thăng Long, the Mongols this time retreated back to a base camp where they could more effectively receive supplies. But once again, the logistics proved difficult and a Mongol retreat was planned. But this time, the army of Đại Việt decided to prevent the retreat, and with their expert knowledge of their country's terrain would cause great casualties to the Mongol army. Đại Việt even employed the effective and previously successful tactic of planting spiked poles into the riverbed to incapacitate the retreating Mongol army. Once again, the Mongols were dramatically unsuccessful in taking Đại Việt. These numerous victories for Đại Việt against the Mongols are a great source of national pride.
The decline of medieval Đại Việt.
We are fast approaching the end of this episode, so we just have enough time to find out what happened to Đại Việt in the aftermath of these glorious victories under the Chan dynasty. Đại Việt flourished after the repulsion of the Mongols and enjoyed a golden age of prosperity and national pride. The 14th century saw much in the way of conflict with the Chams of Champa to the south. Champa was weakened by internal disagreements, and Đại Việt was happy to take advantage of this. After a number of military campaigns conducted by Đại Việt, Champa became their vassal state. Well, it didn't take long for Champa to wriggle out from under Dai Viet's control though, and further still the Chams also planned invasions of Dai Viet later on in the 14th century. Dai Viet had got off to a strong start to the 14th century, but a number of factors saw its weakening as the century passed through. Champa was encouraged to invade Dai Viet in the 1360s following a succession dispute in Dai Viet, and Champa showed signs of being able to defeat their northern neighbours. In 1371, Champa sacked the Dai Viet capital at Tan Long. Half a dozen years later, Dai Viet launched its own attack on the Champa capital city, Vijaya. Not only did Champa resist the attack, but the Dai Viet Emperor Chan Sui Tong was killed, along with many other high-ranking Dai Viet military leaders. The Chams attacked the Dai Viet capital once again in the 1380s, but all of this warfare was costing both sides dearly, and by the end of the 1380s, a truce was agreed between both of these exhausted states. The Chan dynasty was not able to stay in power for long after this protracted war between Dai Viet and Champa, and would eventually be deposed in the year 1400. A court official called Ho Qui Li, who had fought against the Champa during the Champa-Dai Viet War, had effectively assumed superiority within Dai Viet, and the final Chan rulers were not inclined to interfere, before Ho Qui Li manipulated circumstances to become the leader himself in 1400 through a series of forced abdications. Ho Qui Li then quickly abdicated himself, as this had become more commonplace during the period of the Chan dynasty, as the abdicating emperor became more powerful than the incoming emperor, often the retired emperor's son. So despite being retired, Ho Qui Li would become more like a grand emperor. And this is something not unusual in the countries of the Far East during the medieval period, including China, Japan and Korea. Ho Qui Li terrorised the remaining members and supporters of the Chan dynasty to ensure that there would be no comebacks and that the Ho dynasty could remain in power. The country's name was changed to Dai Nu, meaning Great Peace. The success was short-lived. Next door in China, the Ming dynasty had come to power in place of the Mongol Yuan dynasty, and the Yongle emperor had ambitions of testing the new regime in Vietnam. The Yongle emperor entered Vietnam on the pretext of assisting rivals of the He dynasty, but eventually the Ming would conquer Dai Nu and take Ho Qui Li and his son emperor as prisoner, and this ushered in a period of direct Chinese rule over Vietnam for the first time in around 500 years. Vietnam, or at least northern Vietnam, what we have recognised as Dai Viet during this episode, did regain its independence around 20 years later, but we will leave that story for another episode.
Study and play come together on a Windows 11 PC. And for a limited time, college students get the best of both worlds. Get the Unreal College Deal. Everything you need to study and play with select Windows 11 PCs. Eligible students get a year of Microsoft 365 Premium and a year of Xbox Game Pass Ultimate with a custom color Xbox wireless controller. Learn more at windows.com/student offer. While supplies last. Ends June 30th. Terms at aka.ms/collegepc.
Marvel Television's Wonder Man, an 8-episode series, now streaming on Disney+.
A superhero remake, not exactly what we'd expect from an Oscar-winning director.
Action!
Simon Williams, audition for Wonder Man.
I'm gonna need you to sign this, assuming you don't have superpowers.
I'll never work again if anyone found out.
My lips are sealed.
Marvel Television's Wonder Man. All 8 episodes now streaming, only on Disney+.
Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode of the History of the World podcast on Đại Việt, and I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you found it an interesting episode. It was a long episode, but there was a lot to fit in, so thank you very much for listening. If you enjoy the podcast, then please consider supporting the podcast. Let's make this podcast as good as it can possibly be. Visit our website, historyoftheworldpodcast.com. Click on the Patreon link and sign up to make a monthly contribution. When you do this, you'll become a lifelong member of the History of the World podcast Illuminati, and you may qualify for some of the gifts and rewards available. This week, we welcome into the History of the World podcast Illuminati Joseph Thomas and Purple Falcon. If you want to get in touch with the podcast, please drop me a line at historyoftheworldpodcast@mail.com. You can follow this podcast on social media. We're on Facebook, X, Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, Tumblr, Threads, and Mastodon. And if you can't get enough of the podcast, then please look out for the special debrief episode, which will be coming in the coming day or two, where I'll be talking some more about the episode that you just listened to and a little bit extra from the world of the History of the World podcast. So a little bit about what's been going on behind the scenes.
Listener messages and reviews.
Dr. Robert Reppy wrote in and said, I am very, I beg your pardon, he said, I am well versed in history. I rarely come upon a history podcast that teaches me something truly new to me, but you caught me by surprise with your recent episode on Srivijaya. That was all totally new to me, which made it fascinating. You do a very superior job of not succumbing to the Eurocentric bias so common to most historians. You treat everyone as having an important story to tell, and I find that quite admirable. Definitely count me as a fan. Well, thank you, Dr. Robert. And yes, I don't understand why we would want to be so Eurocentric when talking about history. History is a global thing. We have evolved globally together. So what goes on in one side of the world affects what goes on the other side of the world. If not immediately, then ultimately. So it's really, really important that if we want to understand today's world, we have to understand what's been going on around the world for all of the centuries that human history has been taking place. But also I'm really pleased that you enjoyed the Srivijaya episode, and it's one of those subjects that's more of a concept rather than a solid factual knowledge. So we have to treat that with the respect that it's presented in, and as such, Srivijaya, you have to sort of understand that there is still a lot left to discover. So it's but there certainly had to have been something very, very important going on in the Indonesian islands during that period, and it's evident by the archaeology and the writings of other nations or other peoples who came across that area of the world. Very important crossroads between societies there. But thank you for the message, Dr. Robert, and appreciate you writing in. Joseph Thomas, who we've mentioned already, said, hello, Chris. I'm proud to finally become a 1C contributing member of your truly unique podcast. Long overdue. Sorry about that. As someone who has struggled with lifelong attention deficit problems, it was very hard in my school years to absorb the content being presented in my classes. This format for learning world history is perfect. I can rewind a minute or two on my phone as often as I want, and lo and behold, you never get annoyed repeating yourself, and I don't need to feel embarrassed asking you to. Because of this, I can fully digest and thoroughly enjoy every word of your episodes at my own pace. I can finally feel my ignorance of human history being cleared away, like an archaeologist clearing debris from an ancient village, revealing the exciting and fascinating details of how we came to be. It's clear that your listeners trust you because of your objectivity when it comes to matters of debate, but I personally always like hearing your take. The time you spend diving deep to prepare for the topics you cover really comes through on the podcast. I'm still in Volume 3, the Caesar episodes, so I have a long way to go to catch up. I especially love that you make a summary episode at the end of a series of podcasts covering an era. This really helps to cement the material in the listener's mind. It would be wonderful if one day visuals could be developed to play alongside your episodes to give us an idea what all these different cultures, tribes and civilizations look like, how they communicated and experienced life, and how they employed the new technologies of their time. Well done and thank you. Thank you, Joseph. Certainly the project as it is plenty enough for me to be getting on with at the moment, and I'll delve into this in the Illuminati debrief episode, so if you want to listen to that when it comes out, you will get a better perspective about how I personally have to create this podcast and the challenges, and certainly the more recent challenges, so I'll go into that a little bit more for you. But it's very interesting how different people listen to different elements of the podcast, and how different people use the podcast in order to enhance their own learning. So, for example, some people listen to the podcast at 1.5 times the speed because they're able to digest the information quickly, and they get very bored with listening to me speak at a very slow pace. But others really appreciate the slow pace because it aids them in absorbing the information. Once again, that's their start, that's their preference, that's how they find it appropriate for themselves. And also, I suppose the other factor being that this is more to do with podcasts generally. It's very easy now to find a podcast and use it at your own pace, and if you want to listen to the same bit over and over again, you can, because obviously I never get annoyed at you repeating my podcast. So yeah, quite right, Joseph, and thank you very much for writing, and thank you very much also for your contributions to the podcast. It really, really does help. I can't thank you enough. Nathan Cox wrote in and said, "Hello, this podcast is amazing, and I loved your episode on the Chabin culture. What are you covering now, and where are you going next?" Well, good fond memories of the Chabin culture episode. That was good studying for that one, and very, very unique. Very unique, the Chabin culture episode, and thoroughly enjoyable. Those Central and Southern American episodes were an absolute joy and pleasure to write about. It's sometimes the forgotten history of the world because it's the New World countries, isn't it? And we often focus so much on what was going on after the Europeans visited the Americas for the first time, and really what happened beforehand is quite astonishing when you look at it. So what are you covering now, and where are you going next? Well, coming up, obviously we've just done Đại Việt. We've got to do the Khmer Empire. We've got to do Champa as well. So that will be what we'll do, and then we'll focus on the Austronesian expansion and how that eventually affected the Pacific Islands, New Zealand, of course. And that will be before we go across to the Americas, and then we'll round off the volume in sub-Saharan Africa. So there's not that many episodes to go in volume 4. It's been a long stretch, hasn't it? It really has, and I've been open to some criticism from some people saying how long it's going on for. But listen, I think it's necessary. I think it's necessary in terms of understanding the world that we do all of these episodes, and they're very interesting, and it builds up a catalogue. If you haven't got the patience, there's plenty of other resources out there that you can visit. Andrew Marr's A History of the World book is great, really, for covering what I'm covering as well in a much more brief format. It's now an audio book, so you can go to somewhere like Spotify and listen to the audio book, and it will compact the project that I'm doing in much less time. Certainly a different style of presenting, but that's what us historians do, don't we? We present in our own style. Anyway, thank you very much. Don't forget to listen out for the Illuminati debrief episode. The next episode will be about the Khmer Empire, so we'll look forward to that one, episode 80. But for now, thanks very much for listening, and until next time, be good.
Spotify, it's Jay Shetty. Are you one of those media strategy people? Scrolling through spreadsheets, searching for an audience that pays twice as much attention to your ads than they do on social? Let me introduce you to Fans. And they're here with me on Spotify. Trust me, I know Fans. They don't skip, they stay for hours. They don't move on, they manifest. They're not a demographic group, they're fans.
Spotify advertising. You're among fans.
The History of the World podcast, written and presented by Chris Hasler. Please consider making a financial contribution by going to the historyoftheworldpodcast.com website and clicking on the Patreon link. Email the show at historyoftheworldpodcast@mail.com. And don't forget to join our social media at Facebook, Twitter, Instagram and Tumblr. See you next time.